Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to the 36th and final entry into the Sabbat Worlds Crusade series. And if you will forgive me, we're going to be a bit out of character to start with, because this book, The Anarch, which sort of puts a bit of a cap on the adventures of the Tarnith First and Only, and Imperium Gaunt, is a strange book. It is a significant deviation from pretty much every book that has come before it, and it feels somewhat rushed. Like Dan Abnett, who, to be fair, has had some pretty serious health issues as well, was simply kind of tired of the Gaunt's ghosts and the series overall, and wanted to move on from it. This is also why the book introduces some story points that seem, well, if we were to be entirely blunt, pulled directly from one's cavernous anus. And I say that despite really genuinely quite enjoying the tonal shift. I have long argued that Warhammer 40,000 should be the perfect setting for some good horror stories, and this is pretty close to one. The only problem is that Warhammer 40,000's focus on larger-than-life heroes and guns that fire literal rocket-propelled grenades tends to complicate the whole being scared part of the horror, of course. But despite the really quite neat tonal shift and the effective use of scary monsters and so on, this really does feel like at least 5 books all slammed together in one, which is not the finish to the Gaunt's Ghost storyline that I would have liked to see. And not just because a lot of the storylines themselves feel quite forced and sudden, but because it doesn't really actually, wrap up or satisfactorily conclude the story of the Tarnith First and Only. Perhaps it will be continued later on, but for now, this is the wrap-up of largely the Sabbat Worlds Crusade and the story of the Gaunt's ghosts. Halfway tempted to do a review on that final book, but for now, let's finally get to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade again, shall we? Last episode, we had a view from the arch-enemy's side of things. Anaquanar Sek had largely realized that the Gaur could not defeat Warmaster Makaroth. Any local tactical victory, won primarily through the qualities of the Blood Pact, would near immediately be reversed and overcome by strategic victories on behalf of the Warmaster. Furthermore, Sek was not powerful enough to defeat the Gaur in a brutal and quick enough time to secure the cause of chaos in the Sabbat Worlds. Neither could the Gaur be counted upon to carry out the instructions and the strategies of Anaquanar Sek either. Whether that was through simple inability, genuine incompetence, or unwillingness was frankly irrelevant. The way Sek saw it, chaos was as good as defeated in the Sabbat Worlds, unless something changed drastically. And the only way that was going to happen was if Anaquanar Sek would be willing to take greater risks than ever before. And so, that is what he did. Not only did the Sek sacrifice hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of his own fighting men in an effort to appear as if he had grown deranged and delusional, but Sek even put his own life and the lives of his most trusty elites on the line in a desperate, Hail Mary play that would, most remarkably of all, rely on men a decade dead. Or at least, so the Imperium believed. But, contrary to the best guesses and assumptions of the Imperium, the Highness, Sir Armaduke, the ship that had been dispatched to Salvation's Reach, with Imperium Gaunt and the Tarnith First and Only on board to sabotage the arch-enemy's hyper-secret research facility, was still alive. The ship had not disappeared in the warp. Oh, well, it had, in a way. It had even been intercepted in the warp by Chaos the Headwalk raiders, who had attempted to board it and take it over in an effort to recapture the Eagle Stones. Their efforts, however, were unsuccessful, partially due to the fact that the Tarnith First and Only themselves had been designated as special targets. They were keys to victory. Although Chaos Forces most certainly did not pull any punches in attempting to take over the ship and grab the prize for themselves. Highness Sir Armaduke and its cargo of Tarnith fighting men, however, managed to resist and escape, returning to the Imperium as heroes 10 years after their supposed disappearance. This, of course, was going to have wide-reaching consequences, as, in recognition of their bravery and achievements, the men of the Tarnith First and Only, and most importantly Imperium Gaunt, had been posthumously rewarded. Most importantly, with Gaunt receiving the title of Lord Militant of the Imperium. Suddenly, the Colonel Commissar was one of the highest-ranking members of the entire Imperial Crusade. There were certainly voices within aforementioned command structure that immediately suggested that this promotion could not be kept in place. After all, it was a posthumous promotion, and since they were no longer, posthumous, obviously it should be rescinded. But due to motivations within the Imperial High Command to get a replacement for Makaroth, it was instead kept in place, and Gaunt, upon returning to Urdesh, was swiftly brought into a web of intrigue, aiming to replace the War Master with Gaunt. Not truly because they expected him to become a War Master in full, but more so that he could become the puppet of many of the more dissatisfied Lord Militants in the upper echelons of High Command. Men like Sibon and von Voits. Gaunt, however, was not exactly the puppet kind, and Makaroth himself had been expecting something like this. He had not taken any action against the various less than loyal Lord Militants, because to do so would seem petty. It would seem, well, as if they had it in essence correct that the Lord Militant was now disturbed, and would lash out unreasonably so against his own subordinates. Besides, they didn't really have a candidate, so he could simply ignore them. When Gaunt appeared, however, he had to take more direct actions, and his was in essence the same as the actions of Sibon and von Voits. It was to attempt to win Gaunt over to his side. Makaroth, however, was a hell of a lot better at doing so than his various commanders, and he promised Gaunt a tremendously elevated position. He would give him the role of Lord Executor. This was the perfect two birds with one stone scenario for the War Master. Not only would he immediately neutralize his primary competitor to the title of War Master by binding Gaunt to himself, by making Makaroth the source of Gaunt's power, and also by making it appear incredibly uncouth, traitorous, and ungrateful if Gaunt should now decide to move against Makaroth. But he could also now placate the various generals and Lord Militants who were moving against him, as their primary complaint against the War Master was that he was not reachable enough, that he was not open to their suggestions, their ideas, and their feedback. Well, the role of a Lord Executor was exactly, in essence, to be the War Master's public relations agent. It was his job to keep all of the other generals and Lord Militants happy. It was his job to make sure that they were heard, and that any truly interesting and or relevant information would be passed on to the War Master. In essence, the office of the Lord Executor, often an exceedingly unpopular one for this very reason, was a lightning rod. One you may very well think that Gaunt would have been hesitant in grabbing, as this would pretty much reduce him to a public relations officer, which kind of sounds like the absolute last thing Gaunt would ever want. However, it would also place him second in line to the War Master, and as the second most influential and powerful man in the entire crusade. Plus, the idea of being crafted as a puppet replacement to the War Master by a bunch of Lord Militants that had already demonstrated somewhat lacking loyalty did not sit at all well with Gaunt. The power that such a position would bring as well was certainly appealing. As the Tarnith First and Only, as is pretty much traditional at this point, had managed to get itself into a spot of bother yet again. A bit of controversy. The Inquisition, you see, represented yet again by a barely competent at best individual by the name of Lakshima, had taken an interest in the Tarnith First and Only, like how exactly they had come to re-emerge from the warp after 10 years. How exactly it claimed to have ran into a much larger Vahedwak ship and then escaped. Why exactly they had been given such preferential treatment by the forces of chaos. There were also a couple other indicators surrounding the regiment that made the Inquisition very, very interested in asking them a lot of uncomfortable questions. The Tarnith originally had been located in a large gathering compound, which had been attacked by Chaos saboteurs and infiltrators. The world of Urdesh was lousy with these people. As the planet had been intermittently occupied by Chaos and Imperial forces on and off again for a very long time, there were those on-world with sympathies in both camps. Some who had enjoyed significantly greater privileges, for example, under Chaos rule than Imperial rule, who therefore might be very sympathetic to cultists and other infiltrators, or even outright agents of the arch-enemy. The Tarnith had experienced this as they had been attacked by some of these insurrectionists. Obviously, the Lord Executor could not be allowed to remain outside the walls of the Imperial Palace on Urdesh. Neither could his regiment, who would now, in essence, serve as his de facto honor guards. The Tarnith First and Only were therefore moved to the palace. This was going to provide many complications, however. Firstly, the palace had of course not been built to accommodate entire regiments of the Imperial Guard, and so they would be stowed away in the wine cellars below the palace, large catacombs used for cold storage. Not particularly comfortable, but not unlivable either by any stretch of the imagination. It would be a significant logistical challenge to get all of the Tarnith First and Only billeted down there, but it was doable. The far more sensitive problem came in the form of Gol Collier, one of the higher ranking and most respected officers amongst the Tarnith First and Only. He had been privately experiencing doubts, flashbacks and memories to his time before the Imperial Guard, when he was a mining worker on Verghast. He had a family there. He had a wife, he had a son, and he had a daughter. Or did he have a daughter? a memory had emerged in his mind of a day that he'd taken his family for an excursion, and he could only remember one child, despite up until this point having had firm memories of having had 2 children. He knew them as well. They were with the regiment right now, Dali and Yonsi, the kids that had been adopted by Tona Creed. Surely these were his kids. He had some memories of them. They were right there in the regiment, of course, and we also know that Tona Creed had rescued the babies from an attack on one of Vervan Hive's tram stations during the initial bombardment by the Zoikans. 2 children, a boy and a girl, who had been with their mother who had died there. But now he could only recall one of them. This was obviously weird, extraordinarily so, and instead of attempting to hide it, which would have been silly, of course, he elected to bring his concerns directly to Imperium Gaunt, who was equally confused. He too had, of course, seen both of the children with the regiment, had been told about their existence by both Tuna and Kolya, and this fear that Kolya had that they had somehow been snuck into the regiment, that they had been planted there, sounded utterly absurd. What, is one of these children going to be some kind of a chaos weapon? A tiny girl, a weapon of the arch enemy, and if so, she must have been planted there decades ago. What, to be used against them now? For what reason? How could anyone possibly conceivably guess that the Tanith First and Only would find themselves in an Imperial command station decades later? It was absurd. That, incidentally, is because it is goddamn absurd. But still, the Inquisition had been asking questions surrounding this, the memories and the strange encounters with chaos. Gaunt promised that nothing was going on, nothing was happening. This was all crazy talk. It was combat fatigue. He would obviously liaise with the Inquisition, and with his new position as Lord Executor, he could, if not order them to back off, then strongly suggest that it would be in the Inquisition's best interest to refrain from further inquiries. Besides, there was no indication of anything going particularly wrong. Now that Ibrahim Gaunt was a member of High Command, he had seen the briefings for himself. Sure, there were indications that Anaquan Arsek was on Urdesh. There were indications that he had gone mad and was throwing away his forces. And indeed, coming to Urdesh now seemed utterly crazy. The planet was contested, sure, but with both the Saint and the War Master on world, it was surely only a matter of time before the Chaos forces were utterly defeated. In fact, news of a major Imperial victory at the hands of the Saint herself had just come into Imperial headquarters, and the Saint was expected to make a return to that headquarters mere minutes in the future. There seemed to be no threat at all. And that, of course, was the moment that the horror movie started. As down in the crypts underneath the palace, all grew dark. Power in the crypt had been intermittent ever since the elements of the Tanith First and Only arrived there. The generators had never been set up to supply consistent power to the entirety of the Undercroft. There were tech priests working on expanding the generator capacities to make sure that there would be consistent lighting, but they had very clearly not succeeded. Now, though, things were growing pitch black. Something worse was happening down there, and worse still, the sound of bone saws were echoing through the corridors. Bad things were lurking in the darkness, as is usual when you find yourself in a suddenly tremendously dark place. The Tarnith were, however, combat veterans, and immediately started to enact countermeasures, attempting to figure out exactly what was making the noise, and whether or not they could kill it, and whilst doing so also attempting to escape from the Undercroft. Tarnith scouts quickly made their way back, even in near-complete darkness, to where the stairs leading down into the Undercroft were. Their little lamp packs, designed to last for years under optimal conditions, lasted minutes or hours down there, suggesting that something was literally devouring the power. But still, the Tarnith's innate sense of direction easily relocated the stairs, or at the very least, where the stairs were supposed to be, and were no longer. Instead, there was nothing but smooth stone where their escape was supposed to be. Meanwhile, in the palace above, Gaunt as well was receiving strange reports, like laughter that could be heard on certain vox bands. Pretty much never a good indication, ever. Moving to find out what was happening, they found the entrance to the Undercroft on the palace level, a massive set of wooden doors that could not be opened. Hell guns were pointed at them and fired point-blank range. Nothing happened. The power sword of Hieronymus, the ancient relic weapon carried by Ibrahim Gaunt, finally destroyed the door, but then there was nothing behind the door, but yet more rock. Whatever was going on here was not natural. It wasn't until the arrival of Saint Sabbat that clues began to emerge. The Saintess had asked someone and awaited a response as to what was happening. It's nice to know that the Emperor answers some prayers, at least. And she had been told that what was down in the Undercrofts was a weapon, an incredibly ancient, powerful and sophisticated one, created by Heritor Asphodel himself, long before the war even started. This weapon, as much warp nonsense as it was mechanism, was folded into an infinitesimally small warp pocket, to the point where it was, in all due essentiality, undetectable. And it could also perfectly mimic whatever target it had been told to mimic. Simultaneously, whilst its power was highly limited, essentially no more than capacity for violence in its immediate surroundings, it possessed the ability to feed off fear and terror. And right now, a few thousand people were trapped with it in the dark, underground, surrounded by nothing but cold stone walls and the echoes of the sound of a saw. Yeah. You could hardly ask for more ideal circumstances in which to harvest terror, now could you? The weapon would also have been able to continue to harvest as much as it wanted, were it not yet again for the Saint, who was able to open a hole into this pocket dimension that the weapon had created in the Undercrofts of the palace. Gaunt immediately took his guard and the Tarnith officers with him and delved down into the Undercroft, leaving behind orders that some form of chaos ploy was underway, presumably targeting both Imperial command structure and War Master Makaroth. He gave instructions that the War Master was to be immediately evacuated to a secondary safe position before moving down to rescue what remained of his regiment. It was not, however, a particularly opportune time for the newly minted Lord Executor to leave his station to go hunting ghosts in the dark, as shortly after Gaunt entered the Undercroft, the stratagem at the palace went dark too, as power to the palace, its defenses, its void shields, and strategium displays were all severed. This happened mere moments after reports started streaming in that similar acts of sabotage were carried out across the city, along with mass uprisings of what was presumed to be cultist groups who had been hiding in the city, waiting for just this opportunity. A major localized chaos offensive was being launched against Imperial command, with, presumably, judging by the locale, the express intent of decapitating the Imperium's command structure. At this point, the remaining commanders, like Van Voigt's, for example, was not entirely sure what was going on in the Undercroft. Indeed, Gaunt and the Saint, who were now heading down there, weren't quite sure what was going on. What they found was, well, not a structure that should have existed. The Undercroft had expanded drastically. Its entire structure had shifted, impossibly so. It was covered in water and pitch dark. The only recognizable thing down there now were the bodies and the blood, and little Yonsei, the girl that Gol Collier had started to suspect may not have been his daughter after all. The masquerade, at least, did not last for long, as upon approaching the little girl, Gaunt swiftly noticed that something was very, very wrong, as the little girl shifted out of reality to be replaced by cutting, swirling blades and bone saws. The Herator's woe machines were real, all right, and they were indeed in Yonsei. The woe machines were terrifyingly powerful. Even the Saintess had a hard time dealing with just one of them. Admittedly, she had been wounded earlier that day when a trap laid by Anaquin Arsec, intended to outright kill her, had fortunately failed to finish the job, but it had left her severely weakened. Many more members of the Tarnith, first and only, would die before they were properly evacuated from the Undercroft, and the woe machine eventually destroyed. Although that was not going to be the end of things either. See, even the Saint had not quite fully understood the threat. There were indeed a woe machine in the Undercroft. However, it was not the only woe machine in the Undercroft. Collier had only remembered half correctly. He indeed no longer had a daughter, but he also did not have a son. Darlin was a woe machine as well. The Herator had created 2 such weapons, and Sek, somehow, had managed to place both of them within the Tarnith first and only. And not bound to the Undercroft like his sister, the second woe machine, having grown just as powerful, managed to break out into Imperial command, where it wreaked significant havoc upon it, including destroying both machines, materiel, men, and commanders. Barthol van Voigt and his command group bravely and valiantly offered resistance against the war machine to aid the escape of the War Master and the Lord Executor. Barthol van Voigt paid with his life for his heroics. There is every indication, indeed, that the war machine might have cut its way through the entirety of Imperial command, except it rendered itself vulnerable for but a moment. For but a moment, it returned to its human form, saying something about the father having grown silent. Having seen 2 of these things now, Commissar Colonel, or Lord Militant Commissar, Ibrahim Gaunt did not hesitate a second time like he had done with Yonsei. Striking the war machine repeatedly with the power sword of Hieronymus, he disabled it, and incendiary weapons were able to be brought to bear against it before it could repair itself, finally ending the threat against Imperial command, and further also seemingly seeing an end to chaos threats across the city. Whatever had happened, it had been very, very wide-reaching. Wider reaching than Imperial command could possibly imagine at this particular point, as this had not been the only prong of Anaquanasek's offensive. The woe machines had been intended to be deployed deep within the Imperial command system and decapitate it, destroying the strategium, killing the War Master and his Lord Militants. Meanwhile, his most blessed and favored agents, werewolves basically, the Kimura, were supposed to strike out against Imperial research bases that were now storing the Eagle Stones. The recapture of these Kinbrak artifacts was supposed to be the second prong of his attack. Anaquanasek knew what they did. He understood how to use them, and fully believed that if he could gain control over them, the war in the Sabbat Worlds would be over. They might even be the key for chaos dominance of the entire galaxy, in fact. The recapture of these artifacts that had been entrusted to the Chimera was also thwarted, however, by other forces of the Tarnith first and only, and by Mabun Etogaur, who decided to side with the Tarnith, well, side with them, sort of anyways, against his former comrades, as Madubum himself also was a Chimera. That was, in fact, what actually had turned him away from Anaquanasek and towards the Imperium. For many, many, many decades and countless wars, Mabun Etogaur had been one of Chaos's chief lieutenants. Raised up and blessed first by the Gaur and then later by Anaquanasek. However, in his words, he had been blessed too often. He had been brought too deeply into the confidence of chaos, having seen what the ultimate end goal of chaos was: complete and utter destruction, annihilation, a self-annihilating drive towards violent conquest and brutality, blood for blood's sake, change for change's sake, pestilence for pestilence sake. Understanding, then, what so many Chaos slaves never do, that there was no future in Chaos, that even if they eventually triumphed, it would only be in order to destroy themselves, Mabon had grown tired of chaos, and had grown tired of war in total. He saw the Eagle Stones and their power, which could potentially complete Chaos's victory, as a threat not just to the Imperium, but to the galaxy in its entirety. He knew that whilst Anaquanasek knew what they were and knew how to use them, the Imperium did not know what they were, did not know how to use them, and in all due likelihood didn't even want to know how to use them. And even if they were to research them for millennia, they would never be willing to embrace the kind of chaos sorcery required to unlock their potential. Thus, ironically, the greatest weapon in the galaxy was most securely and safely entrusted in the hands of the single largest military in the galaxy. That was the reason why he betrayed his former comrades, and fought so hard to ensure that the Eagle Stones would not fall back into their grasps. And, somewhat underwhelmingly, the Chimera were indeed all defeated. Again, somewhat pathetic. Supposedly, these guys were able to take on entire platoons by themselves. And yet, they were defeated disturbingly easily. The Chaos Uprisings across the city were also not really intended to achieve much other than to distract the Imperium, to keep them away from the Eagle Stones and to keep them away from the palace. Anarchanoir Sec himself was organizing yet further escalations. Once the Imperium was decapitated, once the Eagle Stones were secured, and once the Imperium was sufficiently disrupted by Chaos Uprisings, he would strike out against them with massed forces of the Sons of Sec. However, he was never able to issue the orders for this offensive. The disturbance that had indirectly led to the destruction of the Woe Machine, you see, was the death of Anarchanoir Sec, caused by McCall, Scout Sergeant of the Tarnith First and Only. Scout Sergeant McCall had taken it upon himself to infiltrate the enemy's primary base in an attempt to assassinate Anarchanoir Sec. Whilst doing so, he had also freed a couple other loyal Imperial servants, like Colonel Mazio, for example, or the Iron Snake Space Marine Holofernes, or Milo, the old mascot of the Tarnith First and Only, who had joined the Saint after their battles on Herodor. His psychic powers had allowed him to operate alongside and with the Saint for many years now over countless battlefields. It was the intervention of Milo that had saved the Saint from Anarchanoir Sec's trap, as he had intended to destroy the Saint via a teleportation device. Milo had been able to warn the Saint of this and avoid the proper deployment of the weapon, but Milo had been caught in its aftermath and transported to Sec's base, where he had been captured. No doubt they were intending to torture him for information, but they hadn't quite gotten around to it yet, fortunately. Together with Scout Sergeant McCall, these individuals discovered the Oratory, a huge central space where Sec was holding a speech to his loyal troops, declaring that victory was now at hand, and that they would sweep the Imperials from the face of Urdesh, and then launch their counter-offensive to destroy the entire crusade after decapitating its leadership. During the celebrations, many explosive mines were detonated in the middle of the oratory, near killing Sec. And then he was assaulted by Milo, by Scout Sergeant McCall, by Colonel Mazio, and the Space Marine Holofernes. He was gravely wounded, shot repeatedly, stabbed, hurt, and damn near killed. But Sec always had an escape plan. In this case, it was a teleportation spell, which would drop him off on an uninhabited island. He very nearly managed to get away, too, whilst his assassins were eventually overwhelmed by the enormous numbers of Sons of Sec's officers in the oratory. One managed to jump through the teleportation spell to follow Sec, Scout Sergeant McCall. Sec almost managed to kill McCall despite his countless injuries, as apparently Sec just would not die. He could not be stabbed to death, he could not be shot to death, even a Space Marine could not put him down, so surely a measly human sergeant would stand no chance, and he wouldn't have either, if it weren't for the fact that he'd kept one of the mines that was supposed to be affixed to the dais in the oratory. A mine designed to destroy major armored vehicles. A mine the Scout Sergeant McCall now shoved down Anarchanoir Sec's throat and ripped out the detonation cord. That's the kind of thing even a demon would find it difficult to survive. and Sek, for all of his many blessings, wasn't quite a demon yet. The death of Sek would later be reported anonymously. It would be listed in official Imperial records that Sek had been apprehended by Imperial troops and then subsequently executed. No mention of what troops had captured him would ever be released. No mention of the manner of execution, by anti-tank mine, would be released either. But Sek was now dead. The voice who drowned out all others was now dead. And the sudden absence of this blanking psychic voice was what had disrupted the war machine. And of course also subsequently all of the Chaos officers and the uprising civilians. Is this the third or fourth time now that the Imperium has pulled off a clinch victory by killing the enemy's general? And with the death of Anaquanar Sek, in all due reality, the last hope of Chaos in the Sabbat Worlds was wiped out as well. The Gaur had never demonstrated any real ability to stand up to War Master Makaroth. The best he had managed was temporary setbacks, usually in close cooperation with Anaquanar Sek, or outright using Sek's own battle plans. The Gaur is a wild beast, a chaos warlord of the old school, in sharp contrast to his disciplined and skilled blood pact. With the loss of the Chaos side's one and only true strategic mastermind, it would not matter how many more victories the Blood Pact could win for the Gaur. No number of battlefield successes would make up for the strategic superiority of War Master Makaroth. And of course, with the death of the Magister, one of the two Chaos fronts would now simply collapse. The Sons of Sek might go down fighting, but without direction, without his voice, they would not be able to fight effectively. His enormous cultist hordes would splinter and be ruled over by individual warlords who had already proven incapable of halting the Imperium in the past. His lands, his holdings would also similarly scatter and fracture. The final chapter in the war for the Sabbat Worlds may not technically have been written just yet. But for all true intents and purposes, the war is now over. The Sabbat Worlds Crusade will be brought to a successful conclusion soon, even if it will take War Master Makaroth another decade or more to grind into submission the remnants of Urlok Gaur's Blood Pact armies. And standing alongside the War Master will be his Lord Executor and fresh armies, built around the core of the Tarnith first and only. Ibrahim Gaunt will finally have the command he was once promised and was denied with the destruction of Tarnith. And perhaps Gaunt will finally have his world as well. The first world he truly conquered, after all, had been promised to be his, to be a new home for the Tarnith. However, few of them now survive. And with that, we have arrived at the conclusion of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade series. Once more, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. And I will see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.